Thanks for introducing us. So yeah, it's nice to be here. This is actually the first time I've gotten to speak with Shannon aside from email. So I'm really enjoying this, Shannon. I'm so glad to get to talk with you. And I'll start off that I really did like your book very much. I'm so excited to get to talk about some of the themes that are in it. So thank you for it.
Yours and your book. So that means a lot. Thank you.
Well, it's funny how some of the things we talked about were very similar. I mean, thinking about the maternal aspects of God, and the absence of the feminine in the modern. Anyway, all of these fun things that we're going to get to talk about. Yeah. So that sounds good. And I think the instructions they gave us were, folk, if you want to drop things in the Q&A, you can, and we'll see if we get to some of them. But thank you all for coming. So I just wanted to start off our conversation, Shannon, with talking about one of the things that did really strike me about your book. And of course, I grew up Baptist. I grew up in, the Southern Baptist world of the 1980s, really. And so I never heard anything about the feminine characteristics of God growing up. I mean, that just wasn't anything at all that was part of my tradition. There was very little emphasis put on Mary. In fact, as we know now, that is something that Protestants often shy away from. And in fact, you talk about in your book that you actually shied away from Catholicism because of the emphasis on Mary. So would you tell us a little bit about what your experience, when did you first start learning about the feminine aspects of God and how that influenced you?
Yeah, well, I don't know if you know this, I grew up Baptist as well.
I learned that from reading. I actually had no idea before that. I thought that was really amazing.
Yeah. So I grew up Baptist. My parents are still Baptist. My grandparents are Baptist. But I will say my parents are not Southern Baptist. They're not, they're pretty like moderate, I would say.
American Baptist? Are they American Baptist? Okay. Northern. They're one of those Baptists running around.
Yeah. And so, I mean, they were always sort of adjacent to that Southern Baptist, like very conservative, but I wasn't really raised that way.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was in college where I actually went more conservative than my parents and was really involved in kind of evangelical, non-denominational church with Southern Baptist roots. And so, yeah, I've kind of been all over the map. And then at 30, I converted to Catholicism. So I've been a lot of places, but I was put off by Mary, I would say, because of just sort of the stereotypical response of like, oh, they kind of worship her or like borderline worship, and so I just kind of threw it all out and didn't really explore it much. And then we ended up my husband and I became Catholic at the same time. And a lot of it was the heavy influence on the social teaching. Mm-hmm. We got really involved in a Catholic worker and the work of Dorothy Day and things like that. So that was really compelling for us. And we were coming away from, a worldview and an experience that we were kind of pushing against. So it was a good place to land. And I certainly didn't plan on exploring the feminine aspect of God, but it has turned out to be a good place to do that. So, that kind of came, honestly, it really kind of hit me in the face because I was sort of beginning to ask a lot of questions about, I guess I would say really examining how I actually felt about the structural, like the institutional Catholic Church, and kind of instead of sort of just repressing all of my feelings about that and sort of just changing the subject in my head whenever it would come up, kind of allowing myself to admit that I didn't like it and that I wish it was different and that, maybe I want to be involved in seeing that change. Mm-hmm. And something personal and it happened in my personal and professional life that really hit that home. And I won't go into details about that right now, but it was just sort of like this, when that happened to me professionally at the same week that I learned I was pregnant with my surprise 5th baby,
Yeah.
who I knew was a girl. Like I had 4 boys and I was like,
Yeah.
I know this is a girl. She did end up being a girl. But so all of this is like swimming around in my consciousness at the same time. And I don't really know how else to say it other than like God, the mother really did just draw me in. And so it's been like a 3-year process for me.
Right.
Yeah, it's been long. Still learning for sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I did not know about the feminine aspect of God, or really hadn't explored it at all until I went to graduate school and I started reading medieval texts. Well, that's actually not true. It was my senior year in college. It was when I was preparing to go to graduate school, and I did an independent study with a professor who actually didn't really care about women's history at all, but he let me do whatever I wanted. So he's always been a good friend and advocate. But I started reading a lot of medieval mystics, and this was actually the first time that I read Marjorie Kemp. It's the first time I read Julian of Norwich. And that's actually my paper that got me into graduate school, was a comparison between Marjorie Kemp and Julian of Norwich. And which is actually, yeah. So I've been, working on them for a long time. And so it was Julian, who you also mentioned in your book, who introduced me to this very common medieval Catholic concept, use of the feminine aspect of God. Yeah. And one of the things that I found was that it wasn't just a medieval Catholic thing. It was actually a biblical thing. And so, I mean, this is one of the things that strikes, I think Beverly Roberts-Gaventa, who shows in her work that Paul actually uses maternal imagery more often to talk about God than he uses paternal imagery. And I mean, we just miss that.
Yes.
And so it's just incredible to me. So anyway, but I was late coming to it too, but it's really, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yes. Yes. And I love that. I mean, I feel like medieval Christianity gets a pretty bad rap, but there is so much of that. I mean, there is so much of the feminine that like in the architecture and the art. And I mean, it's like, some of it is just very vaginal, for lack of a
no, it is. And I mean, no, exactly. And it wasn't something that they were, it had nothing to do with feminism. It had nothing to do with, any of the things that we associate this type. We associate maternal imagery of God with the feminist movement, with the modern feminist movement. And I'm like, male priests were doing that in the 12th century. Right. And I'm like, that had nothing to do with the feminist movement.
That's amazing.
It's biblical. It's because it's biblical. And so, one of my favorite images, in fact, I'm going to be talking about it at Notre Dame next week, is, have you seen shrine Madonnas? Have you seen shrine? They don't actually exist. They're not of use anymore. But they were, so I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but they're images of the Virgin Mary. They're late medieval images of the Virgin Mary. They're beautiful craftsmanship, and they're split in the middle. They're called opening Madonnas or shrine Madonnas, and you open it up. And so it's the body of Mary. And she's usually holding the Christ child on the outside. One of my favorite ones, she's holding an apple and she's holding Jesus. Wow. It's great, but it has a line down the middle, and you open it up, and inside her is the Godhead.
Oh, wow.
In the body of Mary. And I mean, it's really fascinating. You should. It's really, now I will tell you, it is a little bit, they actually were deemed heretical because they do get a little, it is a little just having the Godhead inside of Mary's womb. But that shrine Madonna is literally the first thing I thought of when I heard John Piper's statement that Christianity has a masculine feel. And I was like, you just have no idea.
Yeah.
That Christianity has mostly not had a masculine feel.
Yeah. That's I didn't hear that quote from him. We kind of different circles these days, but that I guess I'm surprised and not surprised at the same time that someone would feel that way. But yeah. And it's funny that you mentioned, like, it's kind of looked at as heretical, or it was, because like the Godhead being inside the womb of a woman, and you're like, well,
well, it is. I mean, you could see how it's kind of they were very popular in the late medieval period. And in fact, I think Marjorie Kemp actually talks about one of them. We know there was one not far from where she was. And she has this whole description that she actually describes the Godhead sitting like on couches in Mary's womb. And so it sounds like she's talking about a shrine Madonna. Wow. But anyway, but you can also see why it might be a little iffy, theologically.
Oh, that's so cool. Wow. Yeah.
Anyway.
I love things on the edge. It's my sweet spot. It's fascinating to me. So
yeah. Well, it just shows how long this conversation has been going on and how long Christians have seen God, not just from the paternal characteristics, but also from his maternal characteristics. So
yeah, absolutely. I also, Julian of Norwich was one of my entry points as well. And it was sort of like, when I became interested in this, like it was sort of that, what is it called? Like synchronicity, where it kind of started coming to you from everywhere. So I can't remember exactly why I tracked her down, but I finally bought her book.
Showings.
The Showings. And that I think that's like my you have like your vault of Christian history in your brain that you can use, but this is like my go-to when somebody's like, no, you can't compare God, like, or use the metaphor of mother. I'm like, well, Julian of Norwich did. She's my go-to for the argument, because it's powerful. And I love we're still on the first question, and I could talk about just this question the whole time.
I know.
I find it really fascinating too, how she's really unself-conscious about like mixing up her metaphors and like mixing up her pronouns. Like she talks about Jesus as mother, and he births us, and all of this. And it's so free and unself-conscious. And I just think it's delightful to read, because it kind of breaks down a lot of my boxes that I kind of, I think just as Christians in our society, we kind of have like, this is allowed and this is not allowed.
Right.
She just mixes it all up.
Yeah, no. Well, no, I mean, that's one of the things that when I first started reading these medieval religious texts, it struck me how their use of gender inclusive language, even, I mean, it's much different from, we get into fights about gender inclusive language and, claim that it's not Christian, and it's been used by Christians for, literally 1,000 years before the Reformation. And so and so I think it's great to expose Christians, even if you don't theologically end up at any of these places. I mean, because here I am, I'm still Baptist. I have a great appreciation for medieval Catholicism, but theologically I'm still Baptist. But I just think there's all this that we miss, because we don't look beyond beyond our own experience.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question, even though I could hear you talk about that all day. Well, yeah, I mean, that kind of rolls right into it, is what do we miss, as a collective whole, as a church, when we're of the, we're kind of, there's sort of a unconscious acceptance of what John Piper expressed that you quoted a few minutes ago, of like that Christianity is masculine, that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, those are masculine, images of God that we have been given from on high, and you cannot mess with it, but as you're saying, obviously throughout history, there's been a lot of wiggle room for that or whatnot. But the time that we find ourselves in right now, I feel that it's really imbalanced. What would you I am
totally on board with you. It is so imbalanced, and it has a history. It stems from really the 19th and the mid 20th century through the mid 20th century. This emphasis on we see it across culture, from the UK to the US, this emphasis on pushing women out of legal positions, pushing women out of political positions. We even know it's sort of the gut instinct of a lot of scholars that the pushing women out of biblical texts, like naming Junius,
Yes.
all of that starts at the time of the suffrage movement. And so it's sort of reactionary, this sort of like trying to say, no, women can't do these things because they didn't do these things, trying to close the door on female leadership. Right. And if we think about, a lot of the problem, just think about the Baptist church. We can even, we can think about the Catholic Church. We've had some serious problems with sexual misconduct, right, across the board. And doesn't it make sense that part of this has to do with our inaccurate or our partial understanding of how women and men are both in the image of God? Mm-hmm. And this, ideas matter. They have spiritual consequences. And so, I think that it's no surprise at all to look at traditions that shut women out of leadership, and say that there's something about men that makes them able to lead in a way that women can never do simply because of their bodies. Mm-hmm. And that clearly, it's like, and we're surprised then that men believe that women can be treated as less than them. So, I just think there's a direct connection. I think a lot of the ills that we are currently facing in the church are because we have a very short-sighted understanding of God.
Yes. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's so frustrating for me, to be, in the Catholic Church that I love deeply, but to see a lot of what I feel are excuses being made for why, like, there is such a, just such a toxic culture of sexual abuse. And like, I feel like there's a lot, yes, certainly there are a lot of reasons, but I feel like on a broad scale, the lack of female presence is really sort of brushed to the side. I don't see enough conversation about that. And I think that in any sphere, whenever we see men and women be given equal power, equal standing, equal voice, equal leadership roles, we see that stuff go down. Like, it's just, and I don't think it's because, like, oh, the boys behave bad when the women aren't around. Like, no, it's not that. It's so much deeper. Like you said, there's a deep in the human spirit that needs that accountability to each other, like, I think we can't be, as an individual, we're not whole unless we're have those masculine and feminine elements, like I talk about in my book. Like, it's not saying masculine things are bad, right? Wagging my finger at men, but it's like, we have to all find ways to integrate that as individuals, but then also as a church and as a society. How do we get the balance that keeps things in the wholeness that God intended? Yeah.
So that brings us to something I really want to talk with you about. And that is one of my favorite parts of Rewilding Motherhood, was how much you really give us a picture of the strength of the female body. Mm-hmm. Just thinking about what the female body does regularly and how it changes in order to accommodate life and to birth new life, and then to sustain that life. It's just it's really miraculous when we think about it. But it seems so interesting to me that when we think about like the evangelical tradition, we even think about parts in the medieval church, and I'm sure in modern Catholicism as well. We hear a lot of talk about women as the weaker sex, mm-hmm. and that that literally we are weaker than men. So I just wonder if maybe you could talk a little bit about that, that irony, And also maybe where do we think this came from? This emphasis on women as the weaker sex, when the evidence of our bodies is quite the contrary.
Right. Tells a different story.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I have a lot of like personal theories. I don't know.
Yeah, I know. I asked you a question. I don't really know either.
No, but it's fun to talk about, you know, so take my opinions with a grain of salt because you're the historian, but it does seem suspicious to me, right? That it's like, I think there's, and I don't want to over romanticize early civilizations and like, or even matriarchal societies, like that has problematic elements as well. But I think, you know, when we lost this reverence for what the female body does, and I don't know when that happened, but I know it was a long time ago. Whenever we kind of walked away from that, and honestly, I think that there is a lot of that came with patriarchal societies, because there was sort of this almost fear of the power that women have. It's very unknown. It's very mysterious. And I'm speaking of menstruation and childbirth and breastfeeding and things. You know, the very fact that the rhythms of our body mirror the rhythms of the moon, they mirror the rhythms of the seasons of the earth with life, death, and resurrection. And so they mirror our Christian story, and they mirror even the liturgical season and the church calendar. And I think there is something in human beings that is really afraid of what is a little too majestic and a little too mysterious. Like, we like to have answers. We like to have things figured out. So we've really like medicalized the whole menstruation experience. You know, it's easy to take a pill and not have a period at all. And, you know, like, no judgment of people who do that, but it's just, like, it's almost like, okay, we can make this understandable. We can keep it in its place. But what I'm curious about is like, what happens if we pull the thread and start unraveling the thing? Like, how does that recognition of the holiness of the female body and what it does monthly, not just when a woman has a child or if she has a child, but every month, what does that insight in us about who we are, you know, about our identity, about our belovedness to God, about being made in the image of God and representing that in a way that the male body doesn't represent. And I almost wonder if there's a little like jealousy there, you know, of like, if, you know, because it is this act of co-creation and this act of presenting a part of God that the male body doesn't. Not that I'm thinking men are walking around resentful of that, but like, you know, in an unconscious way, there's a fear of the unknown, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and really, if we think back on a lot of these texts that were written, I mean, women's voices have not been as prominent as male voices. And so a lot of the conversations about a woman's body have been done by men, who don't experience. And so it's, you know, it's like if all the medical texts about, and all of the religious texts and everything that we understood about the male body came only through women. I mean, if we think about the reverse, I mean, you know, I would never be one who, it's come up a couple of times where, you know, somebody was like, well, why are you advocating for matriarchy? And I'm like, matriarchy is, I was like, I'm not advocating for matriarchy. I'm not advocating for the opposite of patriarchy. I'm advocating for, you know, advocating for the central position that women and men together are in the image of God and are equally important before God. And so we need both of us together in this understanding. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be in the, I don't want to privilege marriage relationship. It's even just women. I mean, this is something that Catholicism, I think, brings to Protestantism, is the emphasis on the importance of people who have dedicated their lives to God and just serving God, and that service, that medieval women were able to do that. They didn't necessarily have to get married, because there was a very valid option. So, it's interesting, but that didn't minimize the significance of both men and women, in the Christian tradition. Right. So I don't know. I think I try to figure out too, I'm like, when did women's bodies become dangerous? When did women's bodies become weaker? And it's pretty constant. There's different time periods wherein it does different things that people, I think our most recent manifestation of it is the Enlightenment, which argues that because women give birth, their brains are smaller than men. And that's all that, and so therefore they're not as intelligent as men. And their role is only to give birth, essentially. Right. So anyway, which kind of takes the emphasis on women's maternal role in a very different direction.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. Yeah. I think that's, one of the things that I try to do with the book, Rewilding Motherhood, because it was, I feel like there's almost like these two extremes of like the idealization of motherhood that makes it the most important thing in your life, your highest calling, above all else, like everything sacrifices on the altar of motherhood. And then the other extreme is, kind of the diminishing of that, or the devaluing that might happen in some circles of like, that's not as worthy, or that's, and I know a lot of my stay-at-home mom friends or more conservative friends feel like that from people, that they're feeling really judged for their decision to stay home. And anyways, but I just, with the book, I'm like, oh, there has to be, and I was really on a journey for myself of like, there has to be a deeper path. Like I have to believe that motherhood itself is a spiritual path, no matter if a woman is staying home or working 40 hours a week, 50 hours a week, whatever. But like, the act of motherhood leads us to God in a unique way that nothing else can achieve in exactly the same way. Not that other paths aren't equally valid, because of course they are. But so yeah, I don't even remember why I went off on that tangent.
Well, it's okay. I mean, that's why Jesus is portrayed, he's portrayed in Matthew as being a mother who protects, the mother hen who protects her chicks. Right. And, and then of course we have the image that you talk about, which I also struck me because it's a medieval, the image of the phoenix, who plucks her breast and feeds, out of her own body. And that was an image of Jesus. Of what Jesus did. I mean, and this is where it comes, it's a biblical, it's not the phoenix, but it's it's a, it's a bird. Yeah. The pelican, sorry, not phoenix. Yeah. My mind's in Harry Potter, I guess. Good place to be. Wherever it is, but the pelican. Yeah. But it's still, but this image of that Christ caring for us is the image of a mother, and the sacrificial love of a mother. So I love that.
Because there's no picture quite like that. Yeah. Right. So yeah, absolutely. I think too, like when we talk about what's missing from the church, I think, there's like more intangibles, like there's a sex abuse thing, but there's more intangibles where I feel like there's, in spaces that are more male dominated, I feel like there's more of a like a performative aspect, and not exclusively, but more so than is healthy, of like discipline is emphasized, performance is emphasized, numbers are often really
Right.
emphasized.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
how many souls did you save? How many people did you evangelize today?
Mhm.
How many is your small group growing? Things like that. Using metrics that's just not a feminine approach at all.
No, it's not. No, you're so right. And
It's like, and this is like Jesus, leaving the 99 for the one, like that's a man in touch with his femininity, like that. And I think that's what grieves me a lot of, the kind of the mainstream church, both evangelical and a lot of, where Catholicism is sort of heading right now is that kind of approach that is very, very, what's a good way? I'm trying to measure my words carefully, but
I know.
Yeah, just a little bit more even competitive, maybe sometimes, and numbers based, and less relational than I believe Christianity really is called to. And
No, I think, I think about this a lot. My husband and I are intentionally at a small church, and it's so hard. Small church ministry is one of the reasons it's so hard is because it is not valued. It's not valued by other ministers. I think, and so I have some essays in me that I haven't quite come out yet, talking about the emphasis, the importance, what we have lost in some ways with this emphasis on competition among male pastors. One told me, it's funny how male pastors are never called back to a small church. They're always called to bigger and bigger church, you're like, that doesn't make sense in the economy of God. God puts people where God needs people.
Right.
So why is God only calling people to the bigger and the better? And some of that is this competitive, spirit. I think some of it is also, I think, the economy of families not being able to live on the salaries of small church. That's part of it too. But still, I think it is this emphasis on this emphasis on competition among them instead of on this emphasis of pastoral care. Which, is really a lot of pastoral care is much more traits that have been associated with women. And in fact, in the 19th century, women made the case that they should be pastors more than men because they were better at pastoral care.
Really? And what happened?
Well, it worked for a while. They were actually able to advocate that they were able to preach because of that. And so Catherine Breckes talks about this in her book, Strangers and Pilgrims, in the 19th century. But then it kind of fades away, but it worked for a while because people realized women were very good at pastoral care and nurturing and caring for people.
Yes.
So no, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
So we have some questions on the side. Do we want to?
Yeah, let's go for that.
Yeah. So one of them is directly for you. They're actually connected. So maybe we can talk about them both. I'll let you get them first because you talk about this in your book and you also just mentioned it. But it's talking about both of them. One of them is, it says, after a lifetime in churches that taught a woman's highest calling is the home, how do you rebuild your life? And then the second question was, can you speak more about the judgment women feel for being stay-at-home moms? So do you want to start and I'll maybe jump in?
So what was the first one?
Oh, sorry. I did the bad thing. I asked two questions at the same time and you're never supposed to do that. After a lifetime in churches that taught women's highest calling is in the home, how do you rebuild your life?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I was writing Rewilding Motherhood, I obviously am thinking moms in the trenches who are with their preschoolers, but there was this second group that was always in my mind, and that was moms whose kids are leaving the house.
Yes.
Because I feel like it's almost an equally huge life stage shift.
Yeah.
I'm imagining, and taking into account voices that I listen to, but I'm not there yet. But there is this element of like, what is my identity now?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the same thing that a woman has to claw her way through in those early years of motherhood. But then again, when she's an empty nester of like, who am I now if I am not, first and foremost a mother? And I mean, in some ways we always are, but on the outside, what people see, what fills my days, who am I if those are not the things that I'm doing, and that's not what I'm called to. So yeah, I think there's wherever we are on the spectrum of our experience of motherhood and our stage, I think that there's an invitation to return to getting to know ourselves again. I think that's equally true for a young mom and for my own mother. We've had these conversations of she's a grandma now, but she's still kind of having to return to herself because she realizes she's lost things in the past 20 years that she gained at one point. And I think that hopefully in the book I give some practical ways to do that. I try at the end of every chapter to give some specific practices to help, because I know that can be a really daunting thing. But I think re-engaging with what makes us, whether that's activities, hobbies, things that make us come alive in a very particular way, but then also giving ourselves permission to explore what our personal spirituality looks like, instead of kind of going by a script that we've been given, or an outline of this is what your devotional life is, this is what prayer is, and nothing else counts as prayer, and kind of opening up those paradigms a little bit, and starting to find what actually resonates with us as an individual, how God made us in particular. I think learning to trust ourselves is a big part of this. And it's also something that often puts us at odds with institutional church and the structures or the authorities that are in place. And like having written your book, I'm sure that the feedback has been pretty brutal sometimes.
Yeah, just a little bit.
But like learning to trust ourselves is, and not everything that comes to your head, like learning to discern and to weigh and to pray over it. But ultimately trusting that God is active and at work within us and is speaking to us, and often will speak things that are contrary to what we've been told, and kind of being willing to go those scary places. And it's often hard and it feels lonely or scary, when you're kind of breaking those things down, but the other side is always worth it. It's always, because you're with God. It's a place of deeper communion and of deeper communion with your true self, which is really a joy too.
Listening to you, it's making me think again about what have we lost in the church by not having a focus on the feminine and not emphasizing, the feminine side of God as much. And I think about, in some ways, we've structured women's activities in the church and the groups that we put in around, sort of like shaping the high point of their life being that time when the kids are at home. Yeah. And then the time before that is like your waiting period, and then your time after that is like your period of loss, where now you're like trying to and that's the way the church tells the narrative of a woman's life cycle stages. And, if we think about it, if we think about how that the feminine side of God, the motherhood of God, is because of that nurturing aspect. The reason that Jesus is described is not because Jesus literally births people. It's because Jesus cares for and nurtures and teaches. And these are not characteristics that are limited to a particular part of our lives. They are things that we can develop throughout our lives and in different ways. I mean, just like, raising kids. I have a 17-year-old now and an 11-year-old. So I'm starting to see, my husband and I had dinner not too long ago, and my son was off doing something and my daughter was off doing something. And I looked around and I was like, in 8 years, this is going to be us. It's just going to be us again. And suddenly, it's the first time I'd really had that thought, was that our kids are going to go out of the house. That's what they're supposed to do. Yeah. So, and it's thinking about, it seems like the church needs to understand that even though these rhythms of a woman's life change, that it's not a story of waiting the perfect time and then loss.
Yes.
And so we need to reframe, not having women, I think, helping shape the way that we teach and care for women in the church, maybe leads to that narrative that does make it feel like it's a loss when you're empty nesters.
That's
instead of actually you're successful.
Right.
You did what you were supposed to do. You raised them and they went out and they became, people who could live apart from, which is what the picture of discipleship is.
Yes, exactly.
So anyway, I don't know, maybe that helps reframe rewild motherhood there.
Yeah. I mean, and also going back to, like, you hit on something of, like, the waiting and then the perfect time of life and then the loss, but, like, going back to that idea of this is the perfect time of life, of, like, this is what you were waiting for. This is what you're going to miss when it's over.
Right.
In the thick of it, it's really hard and it doesn't feel like that.
I know.
And it's also, there's also all kinds of grief wrapped up in that of infertility or children with special needs or moms who are depressed. I mean, there's always things that I feel like almost every woman I know is dealing with some form of grief and pain and loss, even during these childbearing years or raising small children at home. I mean, divorce, aging parents, anything, but it is very much like, it's very centered on just the mom thing. Okay, you have your mom group so that you have community, so that you can have play dates, and then doesn't that take care of everything? So that kind of bleeds into the question about, some people feeling judgment about being a stay-at-home mom. And when I said that, I mean, they more so feel it from the wider culture, in secular spaces, not within the church, but we're at a really interesting point in Catholicism where there's a lot of absorption of evangelical culture going on.
You're
not my
exactly
favorite thing, to be honest, but some of it's good. People are reading their Bibles more and things like that, which is good. But there's kind of this this kind of growing feeling of separation between the world and the church that I don't feel like has always been true of Catholicism. And so there's, I think that, a lot of women stay home and because it is hard and because sometimes they don't feel like they have a choice, but sometimes they joyfully choose it because that's what they want. But when they see kind of the push of feminism and the society cheering for women who are boss babes or who are accomplishing things or having these professional careers, they feel really left behind.
Yeah.
They feel like the work that they're doing isn't
not valuable
to our society, when in fact, clearly
it's incredibly
raising the next generation is very incredibly valuable. But I can see how that would feel, and in some ways, I haven't always been a working mom. At the beginning, I was, exclusively a stay-at-home mom, and I dealt with a little bit of that feeling, of feeling that. So I definitely understand it. So hopefully that brings some clarity to April's question.
No, I think that's good. And I think that's part of what, some of this imbalance that we have, and even this where we have women who feel like if they stay at home, that people are judging them and that they're not being valued. And then we have women who, when they work, they feel like they're being judged and, and that the church is, when the church only plans Bible studies at 9:30 in the morning, working women can't go. And so it certainly is a statement on what they think women should be doing when they only, plan. So, it kind of goes both ways. But I think if we think about that motherhood and that what God, the emphasis that women really are made in the image of God, just like men, that their identity is that our identities are not tied up in what we do, but our identities are tied up in God, then it frees women from, they really can do what God calls them to do. And if God calls them to be if it's best for their families for them to be a stay-at-home mom, then there's not, that's their identity is in God. It's not in those circumstances. And the same with work. My gosh, if my identity was tied up in my work, I think I'd be a really sad person most of the time, because work, especially in academia is hard. Yeah. People are always telling you how wrong you are. So I'm really glad my identity is not in my work.
Yes. That's, I love that you said that you brought it back to that idea of identity, because I think it is really easy, whatever your motherhood looks like. I think on both sides, it's really easy to cling to that as the identity. And when we do, it makes us insecure and defensive.
Yes, exactly. And it makes us also not be gracious towards women who are in other stages. That's really, in my book, my goal was for women to really be able to do whatever God calls them to do. And I'm not going to put limits on what God, whether it's in the home, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's a combination. Women have always done a variety of things throughout church history. And I think they should be able to do that.
Yeah.
So anyway, we talked for a while about that. I was looking to see if there were any other questions that had come up on the chat for us. But I think, there's one question that we had that maybe we both should talk about real fast, or at least you talk about before we get to the end. But that is the question about how, thinking about that, both of us have been in conservative church environments. Both of us, in fact, in Catholicism, there's a push for women to be ordained, but women are mostly not ordained. That's anyway. And so, the question is how do we both live in these structures where we know women are not valued in the same ways as men, and why do we stay?
Yeah. Now we can talk about this for another hour. Yeah, it's something that I have wrestled a lot with the past few years. And I think for me, I've been in different places with it. For a while, it was sort of something that I could say that I sort of begrudgingly accepted. I would assent to, but I was hoping that would change. And I reached a point where I kind of decided that was no longer working. That was no longer feeling true to who I knew God to be and what my experience of God was. Right. And so at that point I was really thinking, do I need to leave Catholicism? Should I be Episcopalian? Or,
right.
All of those questions. And for me, and when I say that, it was like a year, it was a long time.
Right.
And for me, I think there are so many reasons that I love the Catholic Church and the Catholic tradition, that I thought it's worth it to me to stay, but I'm going to have to be a part of pushing for change. Right. I can't just stay and do what I have been doing. That no longer feels like an option for me. And so, yeah, I kind of decided to posture my heart a little bit differently. And it felt like that, and it's right now feels like that is enough for me to be able to just be honest about how I feel, to throw my voice with the choir who's calling for change and for women's ordination and a female diaconate, and
yes,
these things that I feel are really important for the health and the future of the church. So for me, that's made it easier to stay and to surround myself with people and voices who are working for the same thing and hoping for the same thing. But that has isolated me from some people, and that's hard and sad. But ultimately, that's my reason for staying, is that there are 1,000 reasons to stay and only a couple of reasons that I would leave. And so for me, it makes it worth it. But what about for you?
Well, I mean, I tell people all the time, it's really helped me having the perspective of history, because one of the things that I can see is that women have, that there have been different moments throughout history where women have been recognized, and that women have always believed that God calls them to preach, teach, and lead. And so knowing that women have always done this, and knowing that women have always felt called to do this, and knowing that churches in the past, that some churches at certain times have been much more open to it than other churches at other times, it helps me realize that the problem really isn't so much, it's not with God, it's with people. It's how we're structuring the churches. And so it's a structural problem. There's, for some reason, we've gotten in these bad habits that these bad patriarchal habits that we need to break. And the only way we can break them is by pushing against them. And so we have to push against them. We have to be a voice. We have to speak out. We have to help women. And part of it at the end of the day is I'm not going to argue for women who stay within structures because they honestly believe that is what they are called, and they believe that's an appropriate understanding of theology. I'm not going to try to change their mind on that. I just want them to understand that you can be a faithful Christian and believe that God calls women too. And so that's really kind of, so I think that, that always, but history always helps me having that perspective. I think that brings us to our sort of final question. We have so many questions, y'all. This has been so fun. Shannon and I will have to talk again. There's so much we could talk about motherhood here. I haven't even told stories about myself laying on the floor crying when my daughter was colicky. And I used to just lay on the kitchen floor and cry while she cried.
I have been there.
My son would be I put VeggieTales on for my son, and I would lay on the floor and just cry in the kitchen.
It's so real that, those new words.
But anyway, I really want people to hear, I want to talk about how women can find their voices, because I think that's one of the things that you really did in Rewilding Motherhood, was helping women find our voices wherever we are. So I would love for you to end us on that, as helping, how can we find our voice in the church?
Yeah. I think before we can feel ready to use our voice in the church, we have to be able to know the sound of our own voice, if you will. I think we have to be able to hear it ourselves in the silence and in the quiet. And honestly, I don't think women are very used to doing that, because we have been so conditioned to seek out authority and to submit. Even women who aren't particularly conservative, like there is this element where it's really been ingrained in the way our life experience is shaped differently than our male peers. And so I think that there is, in the book, I talk about the story of Adam and Eve, and sort of how that story is used to sort of scare girls and women into not trusting ourselves and to second guessing and to thinking like, oh, our instincts are probably bad. Our instincts are probably dangerous.
Right.
And so, yeah, listening to, you know, to our own voice is sort of a spiritual practice, as sort of not necessarily taking everything that comes into our mind as sacred truth, you know, but weighing it and discerning it and taking it seriously, I guess is what I would say. So it doesn't have to be infallible, but it also is worthy of being taken seriously and worthy of being explored. And so I think that requires us to take time to prioritize our own mental health and spiritual life, to be getting times of silence and times of solitude, to experiment with ways that we do pray best and do hear God most clearly. And I totally get that saying you need times of silence and solitude can feel really impossible depending on people's seasons of life. But I think that's where we have to draw boundaries and advocate for ourselves.
Yes. I love that part where you talked about drawing boundaries. Yeah.
You're like, we're really used to being in the position of self-sacrifice and being the one who gives, and
like the pelican, not the phoenix.
Yeah. Yes, the pelican, being the one who makes the accommodations. But it is well within our rights and our human dignity to ask for what we need. And I think we've got to practice doing that. And once we are able to get to that kind of healthy place and know and trust the sound of our own voice, then I think we can feel more ready to bring it into the public sphere, into the church, and hopefully get to see some change.
No, I think that, I always think about it. It wasn't until I started reading medieval sermons that I started realizing the prominence of texts in the New Testament, Jesus' encounters with women, that when Jesus encounters women, very often the story ends up with him telling the women that they are of great faith and him listening to the women. And what's really funny is that it's mostly women that we hear those stories with, that Jesus stops and listens to them. And it makes me think about how, that women often are not the ones who people stop and listen to. And yet we serve a God who listened to us.
Yeah.
And so I think it's, it's great, to think of, to help women, just reading those stories about how Jesus heard us, can help us find our voice.
Oh, I love that. That's great.
So, well, I think we're right on the money at 7:00. We must be professionals or something at doing this. But
delightful. It was so nice to talk to you.
It was so nice to talk to you too. So thank you everyone for coming and listening to us tonight. And anyway, we appreciate it. So
thank you.